This episode is brought to you by Netflix. Jay Kelly, the new film from Academy Award nominee Noah Baumbach. George Clooney stars as an actor confronting his past and present on a journey of self-discovery, alongside Adam Sandler as his devoted manager. Critics are calling it a declaration of love to the chaotic art of filmmaking, with the Wall Street Journal praising it as a transcendent comedy drama. Jay Kelly is now playing only on Netflix.
Introducing Meta Ray-Ban Display, the world's most advanced AI glasses. With a full color display built into the lens of the glasses, it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. Send and receive messages, translate or caption live conversations, collaborate with Meta AI, and more. Be one of the first to try Meta Ray-Ban Display. Visit meta.com/Meta Ray-Ban Display to book a demo and find your pair.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Today's episode is brought to you by Babbel, the #1 selling language learning app in the world. Now, as you know, Ben Franklin's World is a show for people who love history. Each week, we talk to historians about the people, places, and events that have shaped our present-day world. But how do these scholars actually know what they know? More often than not, they know what they know because they've spent dozens, if not hundreds of hours poring over manuscripts, letters, and ledger books, often in several different languages. See, the past didn't just happen in one language, so the study of it can't happen in just one language either. That's why I'm a huge fan of language learning. Learning and understanding a new language enriches not only your mind, but your knowledge of the size and scope of the world and its history. And with Babbel, you can learn just about any language you want to learn, like Spanish, French, Italian, German, Russian, or even one of my additional languages, Dutch or Nederlands. And you can learn these languages through fun lessons that take just 10 to 15 minutes. You can take these lessons through Babbel's handy smartphone or tablet app, or online with your computer. Now, what's great about Babbel's fun lessons are their practicality. Babbel's designed its lessons to take you through all sorts of practical situations, like chatting with new friends, ordering food, asking for directions, and more. The practicality and fun of language learning through Babbel is something that you can try for yourself. Babbel is offering you a special listener-only discount of 50% off your first 3 months. So go to Babbel.com and use offer code BFWorld to take advantage of this offer. That's Babbel, BABBEL.com, and use promo code BFWorld to get 50% off your first 3 months.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 200 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Wow, we're here! Episode 200. Gosh, I have to tell you, I don't think I ever expected to make it this far as a podcasting historian. Honestly, Ben Franklin's World started out as a hobby. I really thought back in 2014 when I got started in podcasting that I was going to write lots of books and articles about history, research historical questions that fascinated me, and just kind of podcast on the side. Only you took a very quick liking to the show. You helped it find new listeners, and you sent me feedback about what I could do to improve the show and as a podcaster, as well as about all the topics you wanted to hear about and the questions you wanted to have answered. So between your support and the help of the folks at the Omohundro Institute, which they gave me back in 2015, I quickly discovered that maybe I should just focus on podcasting for a while and get better at it. So here we are at this really big milestone, and it's really because of you that we're here. Thank you so much for all of your support and encouragement over the years. Thank you for listening to the show and considering our guests' ideas about history. And thank you for telling others about this podcast. Podcasts grow and get better because of active listeners like yourself. This is why this big milestone episode is dedicated to you. Now, as you may recall, not too long ago, I asked you to send me your questions about early American history. And wow, did you respond? You asked a lot of very different questions, and sometimes you asked as many as 5 questions in one question. It was a move I really appreciated because you know I'm a fan of a good compound question. So the challenge for this episode became, how do I create an episode that answers your questions, adds some detail and depth to the information you're seeking, and that can stand as a coherent, easy-to-follow episode? So I decided that the best thing to do was to group like questions and topics and see if these groupings yielded a solution. And I'm happy to report they did. It turns out that there was a question that many people asked, and that there were other questions that centered on similar topics. So in this episode, we're going to cover 3 different aspects of early American history: education, the postal service, and the number 1 most asked about topic, health and hygiene. Okay, before we dive into this episode, just a couple of quick notes about my process in creating it. Nearly every question I posed to our guests came from a listener, but not every listener wanted me to say their name on the air, so I respected that. Also, sometimes I did add a question here or there to elicit more context and to dive deeper when I felt it was necessary, because I really wanted us to explore the information and topics you wanted to know more about. And that was my process. Finally, the Omohundro Institute's digital projects team and I really have been working hard behind the scenes to incorporate your survey and email feedback about the show into the show. And I can't wait to tell you all about what we've been up to, and I will at the end of this episode. So be sure you listen through to the end for our really exciting news. Okay, let's get to it. We're going to start today's exploration of early American history by exploring early Americans' ideas about education. To help us with this investigation, we will meet with Johann Neem, a professor of history at Western Washington University and one of the foremost experts in the history of education in early America. His most recent book is called Democracy Schools: The Rise of Public Education in America. Now, during our conversation with Johann, we'll discover when and why Americans started to found and support free education, how systems of education varied by geographic and cultural regions, and when and why Americans founded colleges and universities. And with that, let's go speak with Johann Neem. Thank you so much for joining us, Johann Neem.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, Johann, we're really excited you could join us because you're an expert on education in early America, and we have a few questions on this subject. First, Walter wonders if you would tell us about the development of free schools in early America. When and why did Americans start founding and supporting free schools and education?
Americans started supporting free education really in the 1820s and 30s, if we think about free education as tax-supported school terms. Now, after the Revolution, there was a lot of rhetoric in favor of increasing access to public education. And even in the 1790s and early 1800s, you had some states like New York and Massachusetts and some other places starting to provide tax support to schooling. What often happened was you'd have often a tax-supported term that might be open to all people, and then parents would pay for an extended term with the teacher if they wanted, or the taxes would only cover a portion of the schooling, and families would kick in what was called a rate fee, tuition, to pay for the schools. Around the 1820s, 30s, there was a bigger push for universal tax-supported education, and you start to see the increasing use of taxation to pay the cost of schooling. And by the Civil War, most northern states have free public elementary schools, and they're moving towards free high schools. And the southern states haven't quite got there, but they're actually moving in the same direction for white students. And the Civil War changes the dynamic in the South in interesting ways, but they're following the same trend prior to the Civil War for their white population.
It's really interesting to me that you note that the movement for free education started in the 1820s and 1830s, because I know I've read laws from the colonial period that show that Massachusetts towns had to support schools. And I know that Boston founded the Boston Latin School for boys in 1635 and a girls' school in 1636. So were these schools part of the free education system, or were they founded as part of a different movement and different set of ideas?
Yeah, that's a really good question. History doesn't always move in a linear progression. So colonial Massachusetts did have laws that provided a kind of tiered level of schooling so that there would be elementary literacy for all children, often provided by tax support, and then grammar schools for people who had the money to pay for it, or in some cases were chosen by town leaders or others. But by the revolution, that system had started to falter, and the revolution created a new spur. So in Massachusetts in the 1780s, you have a renewed effort to recreate that town-based system through tax support. And Massachusetts is one of the earliest to move towards what we think of as a public system in which taxes are the source of income. But even in Massachusetts, schools relied on lots of in-kind support from families, from boarding teachers to providing wood for the schoolhouse to, in many cases, actually paying rate fees. But Massachusetts is a leader in the shift towards public education, and that builds on this colonial heritage.
Now, regional variation in schools is something that interests us, and it sounds like systems of education, whether we're talking about the colonial period or in the new United States, may have varied by region. So, would you tell us more about these variations?
There was a lot of regional diversity, but what's more interesting to me is the fact that places like Massachusetts and New York acted as leaders and states started to emulate them. So you see in places like North Carolina and Alabama and Ohio references to what's happening in places like New York and Massachusetts. And how can we make that happen here? And so there is a real kind of national movement, but it's not national in the sense that it's organized by some national organization or by the federal government, but rather through the exchange of ideas and emulation among states. But schools themselves were locally governed institutions. State legislatures often created the spur to schooling by providing initially incentives for communities to organize schoolhouses. For example, they'd say, we'll give you X amount of taxation if your community forms a district, holds a meeting, and agrees to raise this many taxes locally. So in a sense, state legislatures acted as a nudge, and then people started to organize locally. And part of that was legislatures simply didn't have a bureaucracy. They had to build from the bottom up. But as they built and as schools started to get off the ground, the nudges became pushes. So almost every state then starts to mandate a certain term, whether it's 3 months or 5 months, that districts build schoolhouses. So you start to move from nudges to mandates, but the work is happening locally, and districts were fairly small. This is before cars, so people needed to be able to get to school. And so these were locally governed institutions, but they weren't completely autonomous from state legislation. Legislatures were often pushing and prodding in different ways to encourage local activity.
I think you've described a grassroots movement. Was it a grassroots movement for education that prompted Americans to start founding schools? And if it was, why were local communities and Americans really encouraged to support schools and education? What were behind these movements?
Yeah, it's not actually one or the other. I think in many early settlement societies, as the nation expanded westward, schools were one of the first institutions to develop, and they often developed as kind of informal, what we would call private associations. Someone would set up a school, a teacher would offer services, and over time, that community would build a schoolhouse, perhaps for that person. So there was a grassroots element in many communities, but the push to make this a mass education system required the state legislature to act and required the kind of nudges and incentives that legislation could provide. Why would people do it? I think there were lots of reasons. I think for some people, it had to do with the principles of citizenship, that citizens needed to be literate. And so for many advocates of public schools, that was a primary criteria. For others, it had to do with providing economic opportunities for their children. And certainly, as more children went to school, it became a social norm. So being left out became more of a stigma. And as that happened, people started to push for greater access. Greater access meant trying to shift the burden from parents paying to taxpayers paying. So there were lots of pressures pushing people towards expanding access, and they weren't all the same reasons, but they kind of converged to build support for public schools. But that doesn't mean that all Americans agreed on the extent or kind of education. These were divisive institutions as well.
A lot of access in early America was determined by one's wealth, race, and gender. So when you talk about greater access to schools, are we talking about greater access for both boys and girls?
That's right. And one of the interesting things about the public schools as they develop in the 19th century in the United States is that they were open to both boys and girls. Now, it's more complicated. You asked about regional variation. It's a little more complicated in the South, where the public schools are a little later to develop. So elite boys and girls would be trained in academies that were private charter schools that charged a tuition. And even in the North, these academies offered middle class as well as elite boys and girls access to education that they would not have had before. And they were often local institutions relying on local philanthropy. But boys and girls, interestingly enough, enrolled in the common schools at pretty equal rates. And as the first public high schools started to emerge, there was even some concern that girls were staying in school longer while boys were often not learning the basics. And part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that for boys, there were a lot of other economic opportunities. And for girls, in some ways, especially middle class girls, getting an education was both something that they could use in terms of finding a mate, but it also was something to do when you didn't have the other kinds of economic opportunities. And for boys, there might be, once you become a teenager, you could work on the farm, you could get a trade, you could move on. And today we see education as so central to our future economic success, but that just wasn't the case in the 19th century.
What about colleges and institutions of higher education? Jerome would like to know when and why Americans began founding these educational institutions.
Well, the earliest colleges were founded in the colonial era, and they were, in the case of New England, places like Harvard and Yale, they were places to cultivate the next generation of leaders, particularly ministers as well as political leaders, and to ensure you had an educated, pious, local ruling class. And that was kind of the purpose of colleges. And it wasn't seen as something that most people would do. And so there was a kind of sensibility that every colony would have one college. And so, for example, when the Baptists were looking to try to start a college, even though a lot of the money came from other colonies, Rhode Island was a choice because it wouldn't compete with another college in the area. And so there was this idea that colleges were a place that represented where a ruling class was forged. After the revolution, you start to see the proliferation of colleges for all kinds of reasons, one of which is this idea that one college or institution has an inherent monopoly started to break away. There were ideas of competition. There were ideas of religious pluralism that fragmented this idea that there could be one college and one ruling class. You also had more educated people as people were coming out of the common schools and out of the academies who were eligible for some higher education. So you see a big expansion, a proliferation of new colleges growing throughout the new United States, especially as Americans moved west. And as you had denominational competition and religious pluralism, different groups also wanted to educate their children. And so you have a kind of blossoming of higher education in the 1810s, 20s, 30s that is quite remarkable.
And how were these institutions of higher education funded? Were they financed the way that common schools were financed, with taxpayer support?
Most were not. Some were. And so places like Harvard, for example, which was seen as the public school for Massachusetts for most of its history, the public college, they would sometimes receive one-time tax support. They would sometimes receive gifts of land that they could use to generate revenue for support of the college. And sometimes new chartered institutions would receive similar things as well. And some of the states tried to provide tax support or other kinds of in-kind support for new public colleges. And so you start to see places in North Carolina, for example, efforts to create a new public institution that would be a civic institution for that state and serve the needs of a republic. Of course, Thomas Jefferson's efforts to forge the University of Virginia is one of the most famous. And so you do start to see increasingly that there is some idea that public colleges deserve public support, but they weren't supported by the kind of local regular taxation that you had in the common school. So tuition, as well as in-kind support of land and other kinds of things that states had to offer, mattered more.
We've talked a lot about formal schools and systems of education, but Chris has a question about more informal types of education. Chris would like to know whether early Americans were into self-improvement, and if they were, what kinds of books, articles, and workshops they were reading and attending to improve themselves.
Well, the answer is yes. I mean, I think one of the amazing parts of the post-revolutionary decades was just how much ordinary people loved learning. We see this in working men's associations that started to build their own libraries, and people would meet to share ideas. Often you'd have someone in the association give a talk or a speech. You also see the proliferation of formal ways of engaging with learning, including the Athenaeum movement. You have Athenaeum springing up across the country with lectures. Some of the famous ones were people like Ralph Waldo Emerson or Frederick Douglass, but there were lots of lesser known lecturers who were either famous in their time or locally celebrated, and people would congregate to hear. And there was a sense that human beings had more potential, but that potential had to be developed. And there was a democratic spirit about learning. And I think that actually supported the formal systems, because many people who would learn on their own in various kinds of voluntary associations, in working men's associations, in new kind of voluntary libraries, as well as through formal lectures like the Athenaeum, started to get a sense of what learning could provide. And I think that helped build support for wanting to offer a more formal education for children.
Now, as you've researched the history of education in early America and in the early United States, is there a lesson or any information about education in early America that you think we'd do well to know about? Is there something about how early Americans thought about education or how they established their schools that carries forth into our own time?
Yeah, I think there is. I think, we're at a crossroads in the history of education in the United States today. And it's entirely plausible that there might be some states a decade from now that have moved away from the common school model altogether, as policies that support either charter schools or school choice or vouchers take hold. And that may or may not happen, but we're clearly at a moment where we're rethinking or asking fundamental questions. I guess what interests me in some ways is there's two lessons I took while I was writing my book. First off was the ways in which advocates of public education really believed in creating a system that provided the same education to all people, and that the purposes of education were public. The primary purpose for the revolutionary generation was to cultivate citizens. By the 1820s and 30s, there's also an idea that a liberal education will develop the unique talents and capabilities of ordinary people. And so in a democracy, democratizing access to the arts and sciences became a mission. And the third one, which is hard for us to think about today, but is really important, is the question of diversity. As Americans became more diverse, as immigration increased in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, there was an understanding that public schools would be places where different groups of people would become Americanized. And historians have been very critical of that from the left and right. Today, we're facing the question where on the right, advocates of choice believe we're too religiously diverse to go to school together. And some advocates on the left say a multicultural society shouldn't impose any common vision of the nation on others. And so if that's true, we have to ask ourselves, do we still want our public schools to have these public purposes? And I guess one of the lessons I took is I think those are the questions we need to ask. Where instead of asking ourselves about specific policy questions, we need to take a step back and say, what are the fundamental functions of public schools? And then ask how to achieve them. And for me, that's my hope, is that the book asks those questions and puts those public purposes back on the table.
Americans began founding tax-supported free schools during the 1820s and 1830s because the American Revolution prompted them to think about education as something that was important for democracy. Education and knowledge helped create citizens who knew how to read, vote intelligently, and recognize potential threats to the Republican way of life. Now, not all schools in the early United States were the same, just as they aren't today. As Johan related, there was a fair amount of regional variation in schools. In the South, It was elite boys and girls who benefited from education when their parents sent them off to academies. Only after the Civil War did tax-supported education become a thing in the South. In the North and Midwest, states like Massachusetts, New York, and Ohio seemed to be in competition to establish what they thought would be the best free education systems. Now, over time, as systems of free education developed, so did a system of state and private colleges and universities. The earliest institutions, Harvard and William & Mary, date back to the 17th century, with missions to educate their colonies' next generation of leaders and clergymen. By the 19th century, the demand for college and universities with different missions increased, so we start to see schools like the land-grant colleges founded in 1862. As Johann noted, we're presently at a crossroads in the history of education in the United States. He advises us to make the most of this situation by looking to the past and asking the same, or at least similar fundamental questions that early Americans did. Like, what do we think the purpose of public education should be? Okay, let's move on to another topic you wanted to explore and ask questions about: the early American postal service. How did people receive and transport their mail? To explore this aspect of our early American past, we'll turn to our friend and my Omohundro Institute Digital Projects team teammate, Joseph Edelman. Joe is an assistant professor of history at Framingham State University in Massachusetts. He's a historian of media, communication, and politics in the Atlantic world, and he's an expert on the early American postal system. His book, Revolutionary Networks: The Business and Politics of Printing, 1763 to 1789, will be out in spring 2019. Joe, it's a pleasure to have you join us, and we're really excited about it because we have a lot of questions about mail and transportation in early America that we hope you can answer for us. So, to start, Walter would like to know about the postal system in early America. Would you provide us with an overview of how people sent mail to each other in British North America?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Liz. First thing to know is that there are two ways that people sent mail in colonial America: the legal way and the a little bit less than legal way. So the legal way is if people were sending things through the British imperial postal system. So that meant that you were sending your letter through one of the several dozen post offices in North America. The limitation with that is that most of those are right along the Atlantic coast. So for any listeners who live on the East Coast or who've traveled to the East Coast, what's now US Route 1, many parts of which are called Post Road, Boston Post Road, or something like that. That's the route that the main post office for the British Empire took in the colonial era. So you write your letter, you take it to the post office, you send it to someone in a far off town. That person, say you're sending a letter from Boston to Philadelphia, when it gets to Philadelphia, the person needs to actually physically go to the post office to pick up the letter. There's no such thing as home delivery until during and after the US Civil War in the 1860s. And the person who's receiving the letter is the person who has to pay the postage. So you don't pay for the letter's shipping until it gets to its endpoint. And that's something that's true until the late 1840s. So that creates a problem because sometimes people don't ever actually show up to pick up their mail. Sometimes they don't want to pay to pick up a letter. And the post office has already paid, obviously, to do the transportation. So what postmasters would do, say in Philadelphia, they would advertise in the Philadelphia newspapers with a list of people who had letters waiting to be picked up. And that would include people who lived in some outlying towns. If you lived in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, some miles north of Philadelphia, you didn't have a post office, your letter would be delivered to Philadelphia and you'd have to find a way to get it yourself in Philadelphia. And then also these people who are delinquent and don't pick things up. So along the coast, if you're sending something within North America, it goes into a mail bag. It goes on a horse with a post rider. And there were a series of post riders along the route from Boston to Providence, from Providence to Newport, Rhode Island, from Newport, Rhode Island to New London, Connecticut, and so on and so forth in stages. If the mail was going overseas, it would go on board a ship. Most transatlantic ships by the 18th century had a mail bag that when a ship was getting ready to leave port, that was leaving Boston or New York or Philadelphia or Charleston, wherever, the captain would place a bag in the post office or in a tavern or coffee house that if people wanted to send a letter to London, well, there's this ship that's getting ready to leave next week, put your letter in the bag and off it'll go. Beginning in the 1750s with the 7 Years' War, Britain created a system of what they called packet boats, and these were basically specifically mail ships that traveled from the west coast of England to New York, which is where the North American Post Office headquarters was, 4 or 5 times a year specifically. And that happens during the 7 Years' War because the British are interested most in military and government communication. They're fine with people writing letters back and forth. They're interested in people doing commerce through the mail, using letters to do their commerce. But what they really care about is making sure that their military and their governments can function. And so that's why it's during the 7 Years' War that happened. All of that is the legal way. But the problem with doing it that way is, one, the postal system has a pretty limited reach. It's almost entirely along the coast. There's one postal route from New York up north to Albany, New York, along the Hudson River. There's one postal route from Boston that goes along the coast and one that goes inland to Worcester and Springfield, and then south from there along the Connecticut River to New Haven, where it joins back up with the coastal route. But other than that, there's really not much before the Revolution if you are inland. So it's got a pretty limited reach. And the second is that it's kind of expensive. So the people who are using it with any sort of regularity are government officials who have to, merchants who can afford to and in some ways can't afford not to if they're doing business at a distance, and then newspaper printers who are using it to access news. So the official post office system existed. It circulated news, it circulated mail, but a lot of people who were sending mail would take advantage of a second, less formal, and technically illegal method, which is the using a friend method. So say you're a merchant in Boston and you want to communicate with somebody in Philadelphia, instead of writing a letter and then mailing it through the official post office, you hear that a friend is traveling to Philadelphia on business themselves. You hand your friend the letter and ask them to deliver it to your correspondent when they get to Philadelphia. So that's the second way that people do it. There are also some of the post riders, these guys who work for the post office riding back and forth between two towns, who are sometimes caught with 2 mail bags. They'll have one that's the official mail bag for the Imperial Post, and then they'll have a second one on the side that, they charge much cheaper rates to carry the mail in that, but they keep all of it because it's secret and hidden from the British Post Office. So people are doing both of these things. They're using the official post office, and then they're using these other informal methods.
Okay, I'm really curious about this system where the receiver pays the postage. Say you're trying to send a letter from New York City to Charleston, South Carolina, and perhaps it's going by boat, or perhaps by one of the postal riders along the coastal postal route you just mentioned. But along the way, there's a disaster. Say a storm takes out the postal rider's horse or sends a ship way off course. Did receivers pay extra postage for their mail when the British Postal Service took an extra long time to deliver their letter?
You don't pay extra if it takes extra long to get there. But the question that raises is, what if the letter is completely lost? Say, what if the ship goes down? And so what people who had transatlantic correspondence especially tended to do is they would send 2 versions of the letter on 2 different ships so that they had a higher likelihood of one getting there. And especially if they wanted whatever was in the letter, if they wanted that to get there as soon as possible, that you give yourself a little better chance. Maybe you save yourself a day or 2 or 4 or 5 or a week, depending on what the various ships are doing. So they did have methods to try and counter that, where you'd send 2 copies of a letter. That happens less, I think, along the post routes within colonial North America. That's really something that's a transatlantic phenomenon. And that's even more something that's a phenomenon if you're not sending it through the official post office, because then you're not paying double postage.
Today, we send all sorts of things through the mail. Letters, books, magazines, perhaps a package of cookies. What sorts of items and things did early Americans send through their postal service, and where did they send the mail to?
So what they're sending is mostly mail. There's not as much what we might call today parcel post or, package delivery, everything we order from Amazon. And that's because most of what's being transported through the postal system is being transported on a horse in a mail bag. And there's a limit to how much an individual horse can carry. Between Boston and Philadelphia, by the middle of the 18th century, there start to be stagecoaches and some early, they're not official freight businesses really until the 19th century, but there start to be enough traffic on wagon and on coaches that there's some parcel service, some packaging service. And people did sometimes use that to their advantage. So the rate for shipping something was somewhat favorable to the rate for sending a letter. Actually, it was more expensive to send a piece of paper as a letter than it was to send a parcel with the letter attached. And so there's this one postal inspector, a guy by the name of Hugh Finlay, who tours the colonies in the early 1770s. He's the surveyor. And so he goes around and checks each post road. He interviews the postmasters, checks the books, things like that. And one of the things he accuses colonists of doing is trying to defraud the post office by sending parcels, but you have to imagine me with scare quotes around the parcels. What he's accusing them of doing is taking like some bits of straw and tying a string around them and tying the letter to the bits of straw and saying, this is a parcel, mail it as a parcel. It's cheaper than sending the letter. So we know that there were parcel rates. We know that there was some parcel service. It's not very big, certainly not through the postal system, but it's there.
It's really interesting that you said that colonists sent mostly letters through the postal service. And given what you said about post riders and postal horses, that makes logistical sense. Still, a lot of historians have claimed that paper was really expensive in colonial America, which makes me wonder just how many letters early Americans were sending because, you need paper to write letters. Would you tell us a bit about the expense of paper and how this expense impacted the mail that people created and sent?
The short answer is that it depends because there's lots of different qualities of paper available. So you can get paper at all sorts of different price points. But in general, in the 18th century, paper was more precious, was more expensive relative to other goods and materials than it would be today. And the reason for that is the material that it was made out of. In the 18th century, paper was made out of rag linen. It was made out of old clothes that you would cook and get the fibers from and then turn into paper. So one of the things that happens is that paper mills, people who make paper, and printers who need lots of paper for their businesses are constantly advertising and asking and begging people to send in their old clothes, their rags, to be pulped to make paper. So there's a lot less of that around, and it's a more expensive product than when they transitioned to wood pulp paper in the middle of the 19th century, right? Wood is relatively plentiful. On the other hand, that means that the paper is far more durable. So one of the interesting things about, say, going into an archive and looking at newspapers or letters today is that the letters and the newspapers and the books from the 18th century with linen paper are in far better shape than newspapers and letters and books and things like that from the mid or late 19th century that are quite a bit younger. Because when you make linen paper, and we know this today, when you print a resume or something like that, you print it on linen paper because it's more durable. So in the middle of the 18th century, you can get paper from local paper mills, and many of the colonies have paper mills by the middle of the 18th century, but it's not of the greatest quality. The high quality paper comes from England, which both because it's higher quality and because it's being shipped across the ocean makes it far more expensive. All of that means that letter writing, and here I'd separate out newspaper printing because they're printing their newspapers once a week as best they can. But for letters, letter writing is mostly limited as a regular practice to people at the upper end of society, people who can afford to buy paper on a regular basis and use it, military, government, merchants who have to transact business at a distance. So there are lots of people who write letters once or twice, letter writing as a practice is not unknown across society, but people who do it regularly are really at the upper part of society. And then the last thing I'll say about paper and its expense is that people used the whole piece of paper when they were sending a letter, if they at all could. You might see, especially one that's traveling a particularly great distance, say across the ocean, where someone writes the letter and it's clear, they date it several times, that it's written in 3, 4, 5 sittings. They find out a ship is leaving in a week, and so they start a letter and then they stop and they come back a couple days later and write a little more. Maybe the ship gets delayed, they add a little more to make sure that they're using as much of that piece of paper as possible. Because the paper is expensive and because, I didn't say this part earlier, but the mail rate is based on the number of pieces of paper you send, and then a little bit on distance, but the volume of paper that you send. So you want to write and use that one piece of paper, because if you use the second one, that doubles the cost of sending the piece of mail.
Okay, what about inter-imperial mail? What if you're a merchant and you want to correspond with a merchant in St. Eustatius? Was there an international or inter-imperial mail service that you could use? Or, did you just have to wait to send the letter with a ship captain who was bound for that specific Caribbean island?
If it's the official British postal system, there's a rate for that. It's significantly higher than sending something within the colonies that can be taken by a post rider. If it's through the private informal system where you're just paying the ship captain, then yes, it depends on the ship captain. If he's a friend of yours, he might do it for a relatively low price. If you're the merchant that owns the ship, he would take it probably for free. If he is going there and you have no other relationship for him, there might be a different rate, but it would be then up to the individuals involved to figure out what to say in terms of price.
Now, what about Benjamin Franklin, Joe? A lot of historians credit Franklin with playing a crucial role in the development of the early American postal system and service. And we'd be remiss if we didn't ask you to tell us more about Franklin's involvement with the Postal Service. So, what about Benjamin Franklin?
I'd love to talk about Franklin. Franklin was a printer. That was his trade in which he trained. He published a newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, for 20 years. And in that role as a printer, he needed access to information. All printers did. And the best way for them to get access to information in a timely manner was to become the local postmaster. When you're the local postmaster, two things happen. One, you get a stack of newspapers each week from other towns, and that gives you the first chance ahead of, especially if you have competitors, as Franklin did, to pick which news you want to publish and which news is newsworthy. And the second is people have to come to your house or your print shop to pick up their mail. They show up at your house, they say hello, they pick up their letter, they open the letter, they say, oh my gosh, what's happening in London? And Mr. Franklin, the printer/postmaster, says, oh, really, something interesting is happening in London. Would you mind sharing that? Can I borrow the letter and copy that paragraph? So you get access to private news circuits, right? If a merchant has a friend in London, letters would include not just business, sometimes personal information if they were family friends, right? To be a little glib about it, how's the wife and kids? And then also sometimes news about politics. People are interested in that. And if you're the postmaster, they're opening that in your print office. It gives you the freshest advices, to use their phrase. So Franklin talks about this actually in his autobiography, that he angled for position as the local postmaster. He wanted that for the access information, and he felt he was being ill-treated by the previous postmaster in Philadelphia, who was his rival, that he was not getting news in the way that he was supposed to. So in 1737, he gets the appointment as postmaster for Philadelphia within the British imperial system, and says quite openly that it helped him a lot in terms of the news he could get, the access to people, the access to information quickly, and he's angling for even bigger fish. Within about a decade, he learns that one of the two deputy postmasters general for North America is ill. And Franklin spends then several months, while this poor man is dying, angling to take his job when he gives out. In 1753, that happens. Franklin is standing there waiting and gets appointed as Deputy Postmaster General for North America and serves in that role for a little over 20 years until he's fired in 1774. And he is credited by most historians, myself included, as the man who makes the imperial postal system in North America functional and profitable, which it had never been before. Parliament had intended for it to be contributing revenue to the treasury, and until Franklin got his hands on things, it did not. It ran at a deficit. So he did a couple things. He ordered a survey of post offices and post roads. In fact, during his career, ordered several. Hugh Finlay, the postmaster complaining about bits of straw, was the last of those, and worked to fund improvements in the road system. He worked to try and get improvements in bookkeeping and accounting, and actually getting funds out of the local postmasters, some of whom would sometimes be, shall we say, forgetful in terms of when they submitted revenue that they were supposed to send. He worked to open some new postal routes, so it didn't really get off the coast, but a little bit, and some of those are thanks to Franklin. He was instrumental in setting up British post offices in Canada after Britain defeated France in the 7 Years' War. So setting up post offices in Montreal and Quebec, and getting a postal route across land from Montreal down to Albany and Quebec down through Maine to the Atlantic coast of Maine, so that there was a postal route that was much faster from Quebec to Boston. So he's pretty responsible for smoothing out a lot of the business of the post office and making it a functional institution in North America in a way that it really hadn't been before.
Well, speaking of smoothing things out, sometimes historians also credit the Postal Service and the need to move goods and information around North America with creating new and better roads, canals, and even eventually trains. Is there any connection between the postal system and better transportation, Joe?
There is, but there's a difference between what happens during the colonial era and then in the early US. So in the colonial era in British North America, the postal system definitely contributes to the building and construction and surveying of new roads. But as I've said, its reach is limited. It's mostly along the coast. It's mostly this one route with a few branches off of it, and it doesn't go into the interior very much. So what happens away from the coast during the colonial era is really the result of the British Army and its road construction projects, trying to reach interior forts and interior settlements and make way into the interior as a way to extend the reach of the empire. That's something that Alyssa Zurcher-Reichart talked about in episode 156. So before the revolution, yes to the post office, but in a limited way, and more of what's happening away from the coast is about the army. After the revolution, though, the post office is really the key driver for road construction well into the 19th century. And that's because the Constitution gives Congress the power in Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers section, the power to establish post offices and post roads. And so Congress, starting in the 1790s, uses that clause to establish new post offices at a rate of dozens each year. So hundreds of post offices each decade in the early United States. And every time you set up a new post office, you have to make sure there's a decent quality road that connects it into the national network. So Congress then will fund roads to connect the post offices. And settlers, as they move west, figure this out, and so campaign and lobby their state legislatures and congressmen to get post offices in towns when they settle them, because that means you'll get a decent road to connect you up to the previous town or to the county seat or wherever and get you hooked into the system.
How did early Americans send, receive, and transport their mail? Primarily by two methods: the legal way, through the British Imperial Postal Service, and the not-so-legal way, through friends, ship captains, and postal riders with secret mailbags. Now, the postal system in early America worked a bit differently than it does today. Today, the mail sender is the one who pays the postage, and we have home delivery. During the 18th century, however, the British Imperial Postal Service required the mail receiver to pay the postage, and that receiver had to go to the post office to pick up their mail and pay the charges. Plus, The system we have today reaches across the entirety of the North American continent and reaches most people conveniently. This just wasn't the case during the 18th century. The postal service of the 18th century operated mostly along the Atlantic coastline, and it only had a few inland routes, which meant that most people who lived in frontier areas really had to rely on the ship with a friend postal method. Of course, as Joe related, not everyone was in the habit of sending letters in the 18th century. Raglan paper and per-sheet postal charges were expensive. So the only people who sent mail on a regular basis tended to work for the government, worked as merchants, or had money and friends with money who could afford to purchase the paper and send mail. And that fact is food for thought. We rely on the letters, account books, and other documents of the past to tell us about the past. So if only government officials, merchants, and the rich wrote regular letters, what does that say about the documents we rely on to provide us with a window onto the past? All right, I think it's time for us to move on to our exploration of your most requested topic for this episode, health and hygiene. How did early Americans bathe, keep clean, and handle menstrual cycles? These are questions we're going to pose to Ann Little, a professor of history at Colorado State University and a scholar who specializes in the history of women, gender, and sexuality. You may remember Ann from our conversation in episode 108, when she told us about her fascinating book, The Many Captivities of Esther Wheelwright. But before we go meet Ann and dive into our conversation, we need to take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. I really hope you've been enjoying this episode, which you directly inspired and helped create with all of your questions and topic requests. Now, as the wide range of topics we're covering in today's episode demonstrates, contemplating the world of early America can generate an unlimited number of questions. And as a historian, I know it's crucial to search for the answers to our questions about history from as many angles as possible. After all, that's partly why I chose to call this podcast Ben Franklin's World. It's not just enough to look at everything through the lens of one person's experience. If you really want to understand history, you need to look at as many people's stories and viewpoints as possible. And this is where the Great Courses Plus can come in handy. The Great Courses Plus courses are taught by award-winning experts who offer you many different viewpoints. Just take the course America's Founding Fathers as an example. The Great Courses Plus created America's Founding Fathers with the Smithsonian. And to get at the early American past, they weave together well over a dozen people's stories so that you can get a better look at the hows and whys that shaped the United States Constitution. But that's just one example. The Great Courses Plus vast library of courses contains thousands more stories, and it's more than 10,000 engaging video lectures, all of which are presented in easy-to-watch 30-minute long videos that you can stream, download, and watch all on your own schedule and on all your favorite mobile devices when you download the Great Courses Plus app. And right now, the Great Courses Plus is offering you a free month of unlimited access to all of its courses and lectures when you visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. Now, during your free month, you will have unlimited access to the Great Courses Plus library, which means you can explore more about history or about different subjects that interest you, like science, the arts, or religion. Or you might even opt to study new skills, like cooking or photography. To claim your free month of unlimited access, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. Remember, that's thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. And Little, thank you so much for joining us for episode 200 and for taking the time to answer our questions about health and hygiene in early America.
Thank you. I'm so excited to talk to you about this, Liz.
Fantastic. Well, as you know, early America was a really diverse place. So with that in mind, would you provide us with an overview about how the different peoples of early America thought about health and hygiene between the 16th and 18th centuries?
Sure. People thought very differently about hygiene and cleanliness depending on their sort of major cultural group and orientation. For Europeans and Euro-Americans in this period was probably the height of filthiness and stink, not just in terms of bodily cleanliness, but also infestations of lice. There's just a lot of unwashed hair and unwashed bodies among early Euro-Americans and Europeans in this period because European cultures believed that bodily immersion was not just not necessary, for human health. They believed it was actively hostile to human health. This is in part because the custom of the Roman baths really persisted through most of Western Europe, through the very late Middle Ages, through, for the most part, the 14th century, I believe. But the Roman baths were associated with the spread of disease, and in particular, the outbreak of plague in the 14th century. And that is why Europeans stopped taking baths, essentially, stopped the practice of full body immersion or any kind of immersive bathing. So that in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, people just didn't take baths. They relied on a custom that the historian Kathleen Brown, in her book Foul Bodies, calls a regime of linen-centered cleanliness. They relied on washing their shirts or shifts, the sort of first base layer of clothing that they would wear, linen shirts or shifts. They would wash their shirts, and then the shirts would, through friction and the absorption of sweat, clean their bodies. And so that's how they thought it was safest and best to clean their bodies. Native Americans, on the other hand, and from what little evidence we have about West Africans, for example, and some of their hygiene practices, they were not averse to full body immersion, although, of course, it was for the most part cold water immersion in this period, people jumping into lakes, rivers, the ocean to wash off. And Native Americans, as well as West Africans, also engaged in a process known as smearing. That is cleaning the body or maintaining the body with the application of oily substances. In the case of people from the Northeast borderlands, they would use bear grease and rub on bear grease as a kind of unguent, a moisturizer. And some historians believed it even had the effect of repelling bug bites or protecting the skin from insect bites. And West Africans would use palm oil. West African cleanliness practices, there's a lot of evidence that revolves around Islamicized North Africans and West Africans, and a lot of the ways in which their religious beliefs dictated a particular regime of bodily care and cleanliness. And West Africans, for example, women who had touched a dead body would immerse themselves fully and clean their bodies off thoroughly. But smearing is a very popular and common way for West Africans to maintain their skin.
So there were a lot of different viewpoints in early North America when it came to ideas about hygiene.
That's right. And Europeans, they actively believed that immersing the body, especially immersing the body in warm water, would be hostile to their health. It was believed that warm water opened the pores of their skin and that that's how the disease would get in, that would endanger their health. In the 18th century, Euro-Americans began immersive practices once again, although it was mostly cold water bathing and recreational sea bathing then by the end of the 18th century. But warm water bathing doesn't really come back into fashion fully until the 19th century. And Native American and African American practices undoubtedly change in the colonial period, but we have much less evidence about the ways in which exposure to one another's ideas and to Euro-American ideas and commercial culture, material culture, we don't have a lot of evidence for how that changes the way that they are thinking about bodily care, but it undoubtedly does change, certainly by the 18th century.
There was certainly a lot of cultural mixing in early North America. We see Native Americans intermixing with different Native American peoples, colonists intermixing and interacting with people from different European countries and cultural traditions, colonists and Native Americans interacting and intermixing with each other. And of course, all of these different groups interacted with different free and enslaved Africans and African Americans who all lived in North America. So I'm curious about this cultural intermixing. How did colonial American views about cleanliness and hygiene impact, say, West Africans' practice of hygiene and cleanliness? And how did, say, a colonial American who was either taken or went off to live with a Native American community, how did they have to adjust their views and practices about hygiene and cleanliness?
Well, I think for Euro-Americans who were captivated and held as prisoners, either temporarily or adopted into Indian families, they would have been induced to adopt Native American hygiene practices. So they probably would have been introduced to cold water bathing. But I think the larger point that your question gets at is a really interesting and important one. It's a really fascinating insight, I think, that you have, which is that exposure to these cultures that engage in cold water bathing, immersion bathing, undoubtedly did help Euro-Americans adjust once again to the notion that bathing maybe wasn't necessarily harmful to their health. And when we see the people who are the pioneers, as it were, in Euro-American immersive bathing practices, it tends to be young people. It tends to be young boys and young men in particular, who are seen as especially brave and adventurous if they jump in a cold running river and bathe themselves, mostly for fun. But then, of course, there are physicians and other observers, older observers, who begin to make the argument that bathing is not only not necessarily harmful, but that it can have beneficial health effects, that it gets the blood moving, that it purifies the blood, that it improves the muscle tone, that kind of stuff. So it's interesting that some of the people who are some of the more, some of the people who have the most intimate experience living with Indian families, living in Native American households, child Anglo-American captives of Native Americans in wartime. This is the same population that begins to popularize cold water bathing in the early 18th century. So I think certainly exposure to other cultures has a big effect on how other people are thinking about these bodily practices. And I would say, too, that in terms of Native American adoption of European-made cloth and clothing, undoubtedly, they needed to begin to think about how to clean and care for European-made cloth and clothing. They really never did laundry before, wearing, deer skins and moose hides and various furs, animal furs. There's very little evidence that Native American peoples engaged in what we would call laundry until they had European textiles to work with and wear. And they loved them. They saw them as versatile and durable, but this would have introduced a new kind of way of thinking about hygiene and cleanliness for Native peoples as well.
That's a really interesting point. Did Native Americans teach themselves how to do laundry, or did colonial Americans likely show them how to take care of their textiles?
I'm not entirely clear about that. Sophie White writes about Native American women engaging in doing laundry, which I imagine would have been a skill they would have had to be taught by basically plebeian French Canadian or Anglo-American women. I'm not entirely sure what the answer is to that question. It's an interesting one. Because, of course, that's, when people talk about selling soap or purchasing soap in the 18th century, they're not talking about buying soap for the body. They're not talking about, like getting a bar of Ivory soap or Dove soap to wash their pits or something. They would purchase soap to clean their clothes. They purchase soap to do their laundry only. So soap is only essentially laundry soap through most of the 18th century.
Speaking of soap, Justin wonders just how often people in early North America wash their bodies, their hair, and about the different soaps, body lotions, and cleansing products they would have used. You mentioned smearing earlier with bear grease and palm oil. What other products or lotions did early Americans use?
The interesting thing for me to think about is that hair washing and shampooing really is a phenomenon only of the 19th century, only when Euro-American people are back into immersive bathing and you get a variety of different over-the-counter pharmaceuticals and preparations that people can buy in the store, in the urban stores, that effectively serve as shampoos. But before the 19th century, I don't think there's a whole lot of evidence of people specifically washing their hair, at least not with a different kind of preparation. It seems like hair was just kind of left to be kind of filthy. This may explain in part the fashion for wig wearing in the 18th century, with, men essentially shaving their heads regularly in order to wear a wig. But I have a feeling that most of the world, at least through the 18th, if not also largely into the 19th century, was literally lousy, that people were just infested with lice, and they would deal with that on a regular basis with combs or with picking them out. There's evidence as well of Native American peoples picking, and some observers claimed eating the lice off of their bodies or off of one another's bodies. So shampooing was not really much of a thing, but anointing the body with oils, with moisturizers, with coatings that were intended to protect the skin, that was something that was very popular, but mostly among African and African American peoples as well as Native American peoples. In the 18th century, Euro-Americans began to use a variety of different pomades and commercially produced lotions and stuff like that. Not too many of them. But for the most part, people would prepare them at home. So there were a lot of home remedies. Eliza Cook's famous recipe book, The Complete Housewife, which is originally published in London, I think, in 1727. There's a very popular edition that is published for the first time in Williamsburg, Virginia in 1742. And she includes several recipes, interestingly enough, for cleaning the teeth and for sweetening the breath. So she recommends, for example, for teeth, combining some alum or what's essentially, I guess, potassium aluminum sulfate or potassium alum, the same kind of chemical that we use even today in pickling things to preserve pickles. They would mix alum and spring water and some brandy to make a mouthwash. They would take some alum and some herbs and rub it on the teeth with a rag. There's no such thing as toothbrushes, though, until the 19th century, so far as we can tell. People, for the most part, were concerned about the appearance of their teeth and the health of their gums and teeth, but they would just sort of take a rag and rub this stuff in their mouths and around their gums and teeth. People were very sensitive about having bad breath in the 18th century, in part because noxious smells, bad smells were thought to spread disease. So people who had bad breath weren't just stinky, they were perceived as potentially dangerous to the health of other people.
You mentioned lice, and Jenny wonders about all the different body bugs early Americans had to contend with and how they dealt with them.
I haven't seen any evidence of particular lice combs formulated for combing lice out of at least sort of finer textured Euro-American hair or Native American hair. I've seen in museum collections and in photographs, I've seen combs that appear to have very tightly spaced tines so that they would serve that usage of being able to comb lice out of people's hair. There are a number of, again, home remedies that are recommended in a variety of different recipe books, different chemicals that either smelled strongly or were even somewhat abrasive or caustic to the skin and hair. They would be sort of rubbed on the afflicted parts of the body or on the afflicted heads. And then, you'd be wrapped up and sent away for a while for it to go away. And at least they would hope that it would kill the lice. I'm not really sure about the efficacy of any of these things, but they're not dissimilar from the ways that many American parents, even today, deal with lice infestations, which regularly go through elementary schools. Anybody who's raised a young child has probably had a lice scare to deal with. So they've had to bring the special shampoo and the knit comb home to treat their own children.
Now, were lice the only type of body bug that early Americans had to contend with?
That's the one that they certainly talk about the most. Fleas as well. Now, fleas wouldn't necessarily hug the body the way that lice actually infest the human body, but fleas would infest bedding, certainly furs, right? As I mentioned, Native American people's use of skins and furs. Furs would harbor lice, but also fleas. And people complaining about flea-bitten experiences in various bunking in with strangers and in colonial taverns and inns. Those are very common throughout the colonial period as well. So lice, fleas. I don't know about bed bugs, and I'm not really sure if people would have known to distinguish them among the other kinds of bugs that afflicted them. The records of the French Jesuits, if you want to think about another bug, they write about mosquitoes and, of course, that scourge of the North Country, the black fly. Anybody who's camped in Maine or New Hampshire knows what I'm talking about. In June, the infestation of black flies is just pretty intense, really a harsh biting fly. But mosquitoes were sort of the more continuous and perennial irritation to French Jesuits, and I imagine their Native American hosts as well. French Jesuits complain about the housekeeping of Native Americans and complain about the filthiness of the wigwams and how smoky and dark they are. But I think in some respects, the smokiness inside Indian wigwams may have either in fact repelled or it may have been believed to keep down the intensity of the mosquito infestation and mosquito attacks on the people sleeping within the wigwam.
Now, in keeping with this theme of health and hygiene, Nick and Maria would like to know how women in early America learned about female health. Specifically, they'd like to know how women dealt with menstruation.
That's a subject near and dear to my heart. I did a lot of interesting, at least I thought it was interesting, cross-cultural research on menstrual practices among French Canadians, Anglo-Americans, and Native Americans. Now, a lot of Native American communities, for example, the Wabanaki peoples that I write about, the people of the dawn of Northeast North America, and also the Cherokee as well, they practice what's called menstrual seclusion. So basically, in a strategy born of efforts to keep blood rituals from contaminating the rest of the community. So, for example, men, before they go on a hunt or go to war, have to be segregated from the community because they're about to engage in a ritual that involves the shedding of blood. Similarly, women's blood rituals revolve around their bodily menstruation. So it's believed that, for example, in these cultures, that women who step over the body of a warrior before he goes to war, or who touch the food that is being consumed by warriors or by others, that's contaminating. If a menstruating woman walks over their body or perhaps touches or prepares food for other people, that it necessarily contaminates the food and is dangerous to the health and security of the community. So menstruating women would be sent away to a separate wigwam or a hut where they would live apart for 5 to 8 days. We don't have a whole lot of information other than communities engaged in this practice. We don't know exactly how those women spent their time, or if this was, basically a week of vacation in their, usual monthly labors. We don't know. But we do know that menstruation was dealt with by taking the menstruating women out of the community. Now, Euro-American communities, the French Canadians and the Anglo-Americans, engaged with menstruation in ways that both revealed the fact of human menstruation, of female menstruation, and also concealed it very differently. So they wouldn't take the women away from the community. There's no such thing as menstrual seclusion in any European or Euro-American culture that I'm aware of anyway. But I would imagine that the rags or the sort of heavily used cloth that they would have used to stop their menses from contaminating the rest of their clothing too much, those would be put in the wash water, probably with the very last of the wash water, with the dirtiest of the dirties. And then they would be hung out to dry, presumably, along with the other laundry. So menstruation was concealed from the community from the fact that menstruating women were not taken away from their usual household duties and obligations and family life. But then the menstruation would be revealed differently, exposed differently through the practice of using linen rags to stop their menses. And then those rags would be washed and hung on the line with the other family's laundry.
Today, when some of us seem too timid to talk about sex and sex education, people will say something like, "Don't be so puritanical about it." And yet, when you look at the historical records, you find out that 18th century Puritans were actually way more open to talking about sex than Americans of the 19th and 20th centuries. Were all or most cultures in early America equally open to ideas about sex and sex education? Or, I guess what we're asking here is, how did early American boys and girls learn about sex and reproduction?
Yeah, I think that's the case. Certainly, more so than Euro-American people in the 19th and I think most of the 20th century. And I think in many ways, even today, the facts of life were never concealed from people in the way that we moderns have made it a priority. There was no such thing as being too young to be exposed to sexuality. Obviously, babies and young children are sometimes sharing in the marital bed with their parents or sleeping in the same room on a cot or a rollaway mattress just next to the marital bed. So if they were ever to have any younger brothers and sisters, I imagine they would have learned something about human sexual congress from just growing up in the bosom of their own families. But even more so, the Euro-Americans who invaded North America also brought with them the European traditions of animal husbandry and keeping domestic animals. And so children would have grown up seeing animals give birth, seeing animals engage in sexual relations with one another. These facts of life would have been very familiar to even the youngest of children in these communities. How that stuff actually happened, the plumbing and the internal effects or the internal processes inside women's bodies about how children were bred and born, those were in fact concealed to everyone, right? This is a period before we have ultrasound and really understand the processes of human reproduction. but they were more especially concealed from boys and men. So girls and women would have been introduced to this knowledge from their older sisters and their mothers in European American communities. And they would be taught about how these things worked, at least in terms of, external observances through the practice of midwifery. They didn't have week by week sort of information about the gestation of fetuses the way that we do now with our medical technology. But boys would have had none of this information. And in fact, this is something that I learned for the most part through Susan Klepp's brilliant 2009 book, Revolutionary Conceptions. And in Revolutionary Conceptions, Klepp argues in some of the last chapters that one of the reasons that women were able to take charge of their reproductive health and limit reproduction as middle-class Euro-American women did in the United States around the turn of the 19th century. One of the reasons that they were able to do this is that men were entirely ignorant of how human reproduction worked. They knew that it had something to do with sex, but because, for example, abortion didn't exist for the most part as a surgical technique until later in the 19th century, until the middle of the 19th century, it was considered completely normal for people to take over-the-counter preparations that were known as menstrual regulators, because missing a period was kind of an ambiguous sign that it could mean that you're pregnant, but it also could mean that you were very unhealthy. And so restoring your menses was a means of controlling and protecting their own health that was considered perfectly acceptable and normal for Euro-American women to do from the middle of the 18th century until the middle of the 19th century. So if a woman missed a period and she didn't want to be a mother, she might pursue one of these over-the-counter remedies, these menstrual regulators. She might collect some herbs that she might have had growing in her garden, like pennyroyal or tansy or rue, and consume those in various teas in order to restore her menses. And this wasn't understood to be necessarily only used as abortifacients. But again, because men were so ignorant, they had no idea what was going on. It's not really until men take over the medical profession and midwifery in particular, what we would call obstetrics and gynecology, that they become interested in regulating women's health and reproduction.
Now, to change gears a bit, earlier we talked about how submerging your body in water to clean yourself didn't really become a practice among early Euro-Americans until the mid-18th century. So given this fact, Chris wonders about the smell of early American cities. What did early American cities like Boston, New York, and Charleston smell like, and how did colonists deal with the smell?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think smell was not just unpleasant, although it certainly was that, but noxious odors were also considered to be disease-causing factors in and of themselves. So if especially Euro-Americans found themselves in a situation that was smelly, somebody's bad breath that they were exposed to, for example, the bad breath of a barber breathing in their face, or smelling the contents of somebody's chamber pot, either on purpose or accidentally, that was considered to be something that could endanger the health of your body. As for what cities smelled like, I believe they probably just smelled like a lot of human and animal waste, which we find particularly offensive, right? Because we've designed technologies in our households and in our cities with indoor plumbing that empties into sewers, that manages and sort of channels that out of our streets and out of our environments really quickly and effectively. Also because, more than 100 years ago, switched to the internal combustion engine and to public transportation on trains and airplanes, jet engines on airplanes, we don't have horses for transportation, or unless we're ranchers or farmers, most of us are not exposed to huge amounts of bovine waste from cattle or pigs or even chickens, unless we keep backyard chickens. So because we've made changes in the way that we produce food, and because we now burn oil and gas instead of hay and use horsepower, our cities have these industrial chemical smells that I think if you took your average early American, whether they were Native American, African American, or Euro-American, and plopped them, through the magic of time travel down 300 or 400 years later into one of our modern cities, they might find those cities to be full of offensive smells that they might have been terrified would sicken or kill them. So, we're used to one set of smells because we found another set of smells offensive. they're used to another set of smells. I think everybody smells. It all just depends on where you're coming from.
Early North Americans had different views about health and hygiene, and all of their views were largely determined by their culture. European and Euro-Americans were not keen on the idea of total body immersion in water. In fact, they shunned the practice until the 18th century. To them, immersing your body completely in water was tantamount to putting yourself at risk for disease. Native Americans and African Americans, on the other hand, did believe in total body immersion. They believed in cleansing their bodies with water and in using greases like bear grease and palm oil to protect and moisturize their skin. Now, regardless of culture, all peoples of early North America had to deal with bugs. Bugs such as lice and fleas made them uncomfortable, as did black flies and mosquitoes. They also all had to deal with the facts of life. Women menstruate. Sex can lead to reproduction. The question is really, how did each of these cultures handle these facts? As Anne revealed, many Native American communities observed bloodletting and bloodshedding rituals, which led them to practice menstrual seclusion. Now, Europeans and Euro-Americans didn't practice menstrual seclusion, nor did they work to hide sex from their kids. But like everyone else, they didn't really understand the internal biology of how reproduction worked. They had some ideas, but they didn't really understand the specifics. And there we have it. The down and dirty facts of health and hygiene in early America. Now, I hope Ian Little, Joseph Edelman, and Johan Neem were able to answer your questions. If not, please feel free to send them or me an email or tweet. I've provided links to all of our email addresses and Twitter handles in the show notes. I also have a bibliography for you. I asked each guest to provide us with a list of books, articles, and digital resources on the topics we covered, so we can do a bit more research on our own. So you'll find a link to a bibliography about these subjects on the show notes page too, which you can access by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/200. And now it's time for the big reveal of what the Omohundro Institute's digital projects team and I have been working on for the last few months. Okay, so you took our survey and you've always been great about sending me feedback via email. So we've been going over all of this feedback and have been incorporating some of it into the show, which means a few changes and exciting upcoming episodes. First, one of your biggest suggestions for the show has been improved audio quality for our guests. This is a change I have wholeheartedly agreed with, but it's been a difficult one to implement. When I started Ben Franklin's World in 2014, there weren't any great apps that I could use to record our guests and that our guests could easily use. So that's why I had to place a lot of digital phone calls. But I've long wanted to upgrade our audio quality. I told the Omohundro Institute how much I wanted to upgrade it, how long and how much you've wanted better audio quality, so they worked with me to make it happen. They helped me find a solution that would work for us. So beginning with episode 192, you may have noticed a change in how I'm recording. I'm using a new app that allows me to record a conversation on both my end and our guest's end. Plus, since the Omohundro Institute is dedicated to supporting this podcast and supporting your interest in history, they went even further and made a big investment in headset microphones and committed to paying to ship those microphones back and forth to our guests. So I hope you've heard our new sound and that you're enjoying it, and that you'll continue to enjoy it for years to come. Okay, second, the digital projects team and I have put together a dynamite editorial calendar for you during this last part of 2018 and into early 2019. In the coming weeks, you will hear from historians you've been requesting. You'll hear from Nathaniel Philbrick, Richard Brookhiser, Joanne Freeman, Annette Gordon-Reed, and many more great historians. And this brings us to our third big reveal, biography. Between mid-October and mid-November, the digital projects team and I will release a new Doing History series focused on biography, which is not only one of the most popular historical genres, but one of your most requested episode topics. In this 4-episode series, we'll explore how historians write biographies, including what they think about as they try to tell the story of a person's life, and what materials they use to tell you about those lives. We'll also ask questions about whether biographies can be written about any individual, or whether this genre is available only for certain kinds of elite people. And we'll make a lot of those inquiries as we explore the life of a person you've been requesting to know more about, John Marshall, the fourth Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. We'll explore 2 biographies of Marshall in this series, as well as the life of someone who is basically the opposite of John Marshall. So there you have it. That's our big reveal. Now, be sure you've subscribed to Ben Franklin's World through your favorite podcast app, or download our free app from your favorite app store. This way, you won't miss any of these exciting events. Finally, as episode 200 is a really big milestone, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Omohundro Institute and its digital projects team for all of its support. The folks at the OI started helping me with this podcast back in late 2015, a time when I was still explaining to people what a podcast was, why they were so great, and why they were so great for history. Now, even before I joined the OI staff as digital projects editor, the folks at the OI, well, they were always there ready to lend a helping hand with advice and ideas. And now, the OI is supporting the costs associated with producing this podcast and with providing me with some behind-the-scenes help. So, to my behind-the-scenes crew, Holly White, Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, and Karen Wolf, thank you for helping me get this far. And I think I speak for all of us, me and our listeners, when I say, thank you for your continued belief that this is a program worth supporting. I'd also like to thank Daryl Darnell of Pro Podcast Solutions for helping me make each and every episode sound as good as it can be. Thank you, Daryl. Okay, that's it. If you have any comments, questions, or additional feedback, please send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. In our 3rd season of Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore some of the biggest issues dividing these global powers today. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, China's growing military might, and also robots. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.